You've lost your damn mind, Maria. You did the unthinkable. Stole a $10 million Ferrari. Chris Graham, the big shot, explodes in rage, his voice booming like a judge's gavel in the hospital hallway. Silver hair slicked back, suit on point, but his cool's long gone, replaced by a blaze of fury and cold entitlement. Maria stands there, wrists cuffed, gasping, heart still pounding from the chase that might have saved Elise but cost her everything. Her nurse scrubs are soaked with sweat and Elise's vomit. Her bloodshot, terrified eyes are glued to the ER door, while Chris, with a razor-sharp glare, only cares about one thing. "My car," he roars, slamming his fist into the wall. "Do you have any idea what you've done to it? Ever wonder why some people risk it all just to do the right thing, not even caring if they get anything back?" It's not an easy question to answer, not for the ones taking the leap, and not for those watching it go down. Before we continue following the dramatic developments ahead, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to give me motivation to keep bringing you more captivating stories. And where are you listening to this story from? Leave a comment and let me know. Now let's return to the story. At the heart of a sprawling estate, where the grass is so green it seems fake and the walls are too perfect to feel human, Maria Wilson stands on the edge of a decision that'll change everything. She's been told over and over she's nothing. Just a maid, a shadow in someone else's house, never to be seen, never to matter. But that day she's about to become something more. Something that'll make those walls tremble and the ground beneath them shift. Chris Graham, the guy who owns it all, likes everything neat, orderly, under control. His world's built on that. His world is that Ferrari. He's got every reason to believe control is his birthright, that the world's luxuries are his guarantee. But when his daughter Elise gets sick that morning, when she can't breathe and her tiny chest won't rise, none of it matters anymore. Not the tailored suits, not the polished floors, not the $1 million cars in his garage. He doesn't see her fading face, her desperate breaths, not the way Maria does. Maria, the woman whose name he never bothered to learn. Maria, who cleans his house, keeps it spotless, perfect, and stays invisible to everyone except his daughter. Elise is the one who sees Maria. Elise notices when Maria's tired, when she smiles, when she's scared, or when she laughs. Somewhere along the way, that kid learned that people like Maria matter. She knows Maria's more than the uniform she wears. That morning, when Maria sets the breakfast tray by Elise's bed, she sees the girl's pale face, her slow smile, her silent plea for comfort. But comfort isn't what Elise needs. Elise needs air. Elise needs time. Maria knows the rules. She learned them the day she stepped into this house. Rules of silence, obedience, keeping her head down. Rules of being seen but not heard, of being useful but not human. She knows where the keys to the staff SUV are, and she knows they're useless now, locked in an outdoor shed. She knows she has time, but not enough. She knows Chircy minutes won't save Elise's life. The Ferrari is the answer. The only way she can think to do the impossible Samardience. Save a kid no one else cares about, at least not the way she cares about Elise. That car is a symbol of a world that's never seen her. It's what's kept her down, kept her working without question, kept her silent. It's the last thing she should touch, but in that moment it's the only thing that can save her. The Graham estate gates loom ahead. The Ferrari, red and gleaming, sparkles in the sun, almost mocking her, daring her to take control, to start the engine and tear into streets that never cared about her. It's not hers. It was never meant for her. But that doesn't matter. Elise is choking. Elise is slipping away, so Maria does what she has to. The keys are within reach, glinting under glass, like a sign. She doesn't hesitate. She smashes the case with a fire extinguisher, her heart pounding in her ears. The alarm doesn't go off. It doesn't even react. She grabs the keys, slams the door open, and runs inside, scooping up Elise with arms that were always taught to serve the rich and powerful, but now fight for life. She wraps a blanket around the girl, whispering to her as she buckles Elise into the passenger seat. The car roars to life, like a beast under her control. The streets are a blur. The Ferrari tears through West Haven like a red streak, engine screaming, tires scorching the pavement. Maria's eyes dart between the road and Elise's pale face. A face turning blue. A face that might not make it if she doesn't get to the hospital in time. Sirens wail behind her, but she doesn't look back. No time to look back. Every intersection is a gamble. Every red light is a risk. She floors it, pushing the car to its limit, praying the tires don't blow. She doesn't care about the chase. She doesn't care about the rules. She cares about one thing. Elise, whose heart hangs in the balance, slipping toward death. Or the hospital entrance comes into view, and she doesn't slow down. The Ferrari screeches to a stop inches from the sliding glass doors. Nurses rush out, and Maria doesn't wait for the car to settle. She rips open the passenger door, pulls Elise out, and runs. She's not breathing. She screams as she bursts through the doors. Nurses swarm. A stretcher appears, but there's no time to explain. They slap a mask on Elise's face, jam a needle in her arm, start chest compressions. The hospital's chaos feels like a world away from the calm she's known. This world isn't for people like her. She knows that, but for one brief moment it doesn't matter. The cop shows up then, the one who's been tailing her the whole way, the one who has to stop her, has to arrest her. He grabs her arm, pulls her from the chaos. "You just blew through 5 red lights in a stolen car," he says, his voice heavy with the weight of the law. Maria doesn't fight. She doesn't explain. "There's nothing left to say. I didn't steal the car," she says softly. "I saved a kid." The cop doesn't know how to respond. He doesn't know what to make of a woman who broke the rules of class and ownership, who did what no one else had the guts to do. But he'll get it. They'll all get it. Maria's not just the maid. She's not just the one who cleans their floors. She's the one who saved their daughter. She did the impossible, and in that moment she proved to the world that the walls of the estate, the walls of wealth and power, can't hide her anymore. Maria stands in the quiet room, the cold fluorescent lights of the police station buzzing overhead. Her cuffed wrists sore, but her mind clearer than ever. They haven't charged her yet, and as the minutes tick by, she starts to wonder if they ever will. They've got to be wondering, right? What's she really guilty of? Stealing a car? Maybe. But she saved a kid. That's what matters. She's not the criminal in this story, no way. Chris Graham's rage had consumed him back at the hospital. But it was fear too. Fear of losing control, of losing the life he'd spent years building. His voice echoed through the ER, quote, demanding answers, demanding someone explain why his car was taken, why Maria dared touch what was his. His anger was suffocating, like the walls of the mansion that trapped him in a life only he could understand. But when the doctor spoke, when he explained how Maria's timing saved Elise's life, something shifted. Maria could see it, even if just from a glance out of the corner of her eye, as Chris's gaze moved from the doctor to her. The words cut through him, a reminder that the Ferrari, the money, the perfect life he'd built, none of it could shield him from the truth of what just happened. Maria did what no one else dared. She ignored everything that defined her, all the rules she'd learned since stepping foot in that house, all the limits society set for her, and she saved a kid's life. But now, Maria's not thinking about that. She's not thinking about how her actions shook things up, how Chris might have been humbled by the woman he overlooked. She's not thinking about the cop who caught up to her and cuffed her. She's not thinking about the consequences. She's only thinking about Elise. Is the girl okay? Did she pull through? She has to believe Elise is fine. After all, it was her hands that pulled Elise from that car. It was her voice comforting the girl as the car screamed through the streets. She promised Elise she wouldn't abandon her. She has to believe that promise was enough. "Ms. Wilson," the cop says, snapping Maria out of her thoughts, "we need your statement now." Maria nods, her hands trembling slightly as she moves from the table. She's exhausted, physically and mentally, but she's ready to tell her story. She's not scared. Not anymore. They lead her to a small interrogation room, the walls bare, except for a few faded posters about respecting the law. The detective waiting for her is a woman, sharp-eyed and calm, dressed in a simple blouse and slacks. Maria doesn't recognize her, but the woman's gaze is steady, not judgmental. Judgmental. "Have a seat," the detective says, pulling out a chair across from her. "I'm Detective Sophia Connor. I just want to hear your side." Maria sits, her eyes locked on the detective. "I'm not the criminal here," she says softly. "I did what anyone would have done in my shoes." Detective Connor studies her for a long moment before speaking again. "I'm not here to judge you, Maria. I just want to listen. Can you tell me what happened?" And so she does. She tells the detective everything. From the moment she noticed Elise's pale face, from the moment she picked up the phone and heard the dispatcher say an ambulance would take some minutes too long. She tells her about the panic that gripped her as she watched Elise turn blue, her breath shallow. She tells the detective about the Ferrari, how it sat there, engine waiting to roar, how her instincts kicked in, and how she did what she had to do. The detective nods as Maria talks, her face unreadable. But there's something in the way she holds Maria's gaze. Something that makes Maria feel like she gets it. "Thanks for being honest," Connor says when Maria finishes. "I won't lie to you. What you did was illegal. Taking that car without permission, driving it through the streets like that, that's reckless. It's grand theft auto, Maria." But the detective pauses, choosing her words carefully. "I've also heard the doctor's report. I know what you did saved that girl's life. You didn't do this for yourself. You did it because you believed that kid deserved to be saved." Maria stays quiet, her breathing shaky but steadying with each passing second. "I don't know what I can do for you legally," Connor continues. "That's not up to me. But I can tell you that what you did, it matters. People will remember it." Maria looks up, her eyes tired but clear. "Is she okay?" she asks, her voice soft. "Elise, I mean." The detective gives a small smile, the corner of her mouth twitching up. "She's okay, Maria. She's gonna pull through. You made that happen." Maria's shoulders sag, relief crashing over her. Her heart tightens, and for a moment it feels like everything she's been carrying spills out all at once. She did it. She saved the girl, but as she exhales, her thoughts drift back to Chris. What's he gonna do now? Will he sue her? Will he make sure she pays for what she did? Or will he see the sacrifice, the love that drove her to go that far? The detective places a hand on her shoulder, and Maria's surprised by the warmth in the gesture. "Listen, Maria," she says softly. "You saved that kid, and when this is all over, that's what matters most. That's what people will remember. The rest? It's just noise." Maria doesn't know if the detective's right, but in that moment, it doesn't matter. She did what no one else dared to do. She acted out of love. And in doing so, she shattered every rule, every barrier society had placed on her. The days blurred together in the hospital, like a whirl of white coats, beeping monitors, and the constant hum of a world that Maria had never quite understood. The doctors, the nurses, the people who saved lives, they spoke in terms of treatment, procedures, interventions, but to Maria it was simple. Elise was breathing. Elise was alive. That was enough. That was all she had ever wanted. But Chris Graham's reaction was another story. He didn't show up at the hospital until the next day, after the dust had settled. And when he did, his eyes were full of something Maria had never seen before, something raw, something uncertain. It wasn't anger, not entirely. It wasn't gratitude either. It was a confusion, a recognition that the world he had spent his life building, the world of control and privilege, had just cracked wide open. And in that crack, Maria had slipped through. He stood in the doorway of Elise's room, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his tailored suit, his jaw clenched. His gaze flicked from Elise to Maria, and then back to the girl, lying there in a hospital bed, hooked up to IVs and monitors. "You," he said, his voice low, almost incredulous, "you did this." Maria didn't know how to respond. She had saved Elise. But how could she explain to him that it wasn't about the Ferrari? That it wasn't about defying his rules or taking what wasn't hers? She had done it because Elise's life mattered more than anything else. She had acted because someone had to. Someone had to care enough to make sure that little girl didn't die. But Chris Graham didn't see it that way. His gaze shifted back to Elise, and for a moment Maria thought she saw something in his eyes, something that might have been guilt, or perhaps understanding. But then it was gone, replaced by the same cold, calculating look she had come to expect from him. "We do stray effer, Tom Shaw. Do you have any idea what you've done to my car?" he asked as if the question mattered more than his daughter's life. He stepped closer to Maria, the anger rising again in his chest, his voice tight. "Do you even know what kind of car that was?" "It was the last one of its kind on the East Coast, custom made." "And you," he paused, shaking his head, "you destroyed it." Maria clenched her fists at her sides, her body tense. "It wasn't about the car," she said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "It was about Elise. It was about saving her. You can replace the car, Mr. Graham, but you can't replace your daughter." There was a flicker of something in his expression. His lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't speak for a moment. The silence between them was thick, heavy, like it was pulling at them both, forcing them to face truths neither of them was ready to admit. Finally, Chris turned away, his back to her. He crossed his arms, standing by the window, looking out at the manicured gardens below. The world beyond the glass was still perfect, untouched by the chaos inside the room. And for a moment, Maria thought he might leave, that he might walk out of this place without saying another word. But then he spoke again. "You saved her," he said, his voice quieter now, almost defeated. "You saved my daughter." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was something. And for the first time since she had entered his world, Maria felt seen. "I didn't do it for you," she said, her voice low but clear. "I did it for her." Chris turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said softly. "I know you did. But now—" What happens next? Maria didn't know the answer. She didn't know what the future held, or what Chris would do once Elise was better. She didn't know if he would press charges, if he would fire her, or if he would simply pretend this never happened. She didn't care about the consequences anymore. What mattered, she realized, was that Elise was going to be okay. That little girl, the one who had followed her around the house like a shadow. The one who had looked up to her like she was something more than a maid. Elise was alive. That was all that mattered. "I'll do whatever it takes to help her," Maria said, her voice firm, steady. "But I'm not doing it for you, Chris. I'm doing it for her, and I'm doing it because it's right." There was a long silence, and for a moment Maria wondered if he would say anything else. But he didn't. Instead, he just nodded, his expression softening, kind of as if for the first time in a long while he understood. "I'll make sure she has the best care," he said quietly. "I'll make sure she's okay. And I'll make sure you're taken care of too." Maria didn't respond. She didn't need to. The tension between them had shifted, but it hadn't dissolved. The walls of the estate were still there, right? The barriers between them still in place. But Maria had broken through them, if only for a moment, and that was enough. The days that followed were a slow drift, like the dying embers of a fire that refused to completely go out. Maria returned to the estate, but it wasn't the same. The house that had once felt like a gilded cage now felt like a house of mirrors, each reflection distorted, and the silence between her and Chris was no longer an unspoken agreement, but an uncomfortable truce. They had both been changed in different ways by what had happened, but neither one could admit it. Not yet. Chris stayed in his study behind closed doors, while Elise recovered in the hospital. Maria continued her duties, but it felt like she was walking on a razor's edge. Every glance, every movement was weighed, measured. She wasn't invisible anymore, but that didn't mean she was seen in the way she had hoped. The house still hummed with its usual rhythm, quiet, detached, perfect, but beneath it, something was stirring. Maria knew it, and maybe Chris did too. The things that had once been acceptable, the roles that had been assigned to her, were starting to unravel. The staff noticed, of course. They had always watched her with a sort of quiet reverence, a mixture of admiration and sympathy. But now it was different. Now Maria wasn't just the maid who kept things tidy. She was the woman who had saved a child, right? The one who had defied the rules and paid a price. It was hard to ignore that, even in a place that thrived on control and silence. One evening, as Maria was walking through the kitchen, Colin, the head butler, caught her eye. He was standing by the sink, his hands still, but his gaze sharp. He had been there the longest, and Maria knew he had seen it all. His weathered face softened when he saw her, and he gave her a small nod. It was the first time he had acknowledged her directly in days. "You did what none of us would have had the courage to do," he said, his voice low but steady. "You saved her, Maria, and that counts for something." Maria met his gaze, her chest tightening. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she needed to hear that. How much she needed to hear that someone, anyone, saw her for more than the role she had been forced into. "I didn't do it for praise, Colin," she said softly. "I did it because I couldn't watch her die." Colin nodded, his hands drying off the last of the dishes. "I know that, but still, sometimes. The world needs to see things for what they really are, not the way they want it to be." Maria didn't know what to say to that. The world, as she knew it, had never seen her for anything more than what she did, what she could provide. But now, after everything, she wasn't sure she could go back to being invisible, even if it meant stepping outside the boundaries of what was expected. The next morning, when she was on her way out to the garden, she saw Chris standing near the window in the hallway, his back to her. He was staring out at the grounds, lost in thought. For a moment, she considered walking past him, pretending she hadn't noticed. But then she stopped. "Mr. Graham," she said, her voice firm but steady. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Maria." There was a long silence between them, a silence that felt heavier now than it had before. Maria took a step forward, unsure of what she was about to say. ill, but feeling that it needed to be said. "I don't expect you to understand what I did," she said, her voice low but clear. "But I did it because I love her. I loved your daughter before I ever saved her. And if it had been anyone else, I would have done the same thing." Chris didn't speak at first, just looked at her, his face expressionless. And for a moment, Maria wondered if he was even listening, but then, finally, he nodded. "I understand," he said softly. "I didn't get it at first. I was angry and scared. But now I see why you did it." Maria didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't looking for an apology. She wasn't looking for anything from him. But somehow, hearing those words felt like a victory, a small acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Chris looked at her for another long moment before he spoke again. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere, "for everything." Maria nodded, but didn't speak. She didn't need to. As she walked away, her heart felt lighter than it had in days. The tension between them had shifted, but it wasn't gone. Not yet. But Maria had taken a step forward, and that was all she could do. When she reached the garden, she sat down on the stone bench beneath the willow tree and closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over her. She had done what needed to be done. She had saved a life, even if it had come at a cost. And now, all she could do was wait. Wait for the world to catch up, wait for the change to take root. And somewhere deep inside, she knew it would. Days passed, slow and steady, like the turning of the seasons. Maria was no longer just a shadow in the Graham estate. She wasn't sure what she was, but she knew she wasn't invisible anymore. The house had shifted, and so had she. Every time she passed someone, their eyes lingered just a moment longer, as if they weren't sure how to look at her, but couldn't look away. Chris kept his distance, but she could feel his presence in the air, in the way he moved through the house, with less of the self-assured swagger that had once defined him. His gaze was often distant, like he was searching for something he couldn't quite find. Maria, for her part, kept to her work. The house needed to be maintained, after all, and she wasn't going to abandon her duties just because things were different now. She cleaned the halls, tended to the rooms, moved through the corridors like she always had. But this time, her footsteps felt heavier. Not with guilt, not with regret, but with something more complex. A realization that her life, the life she had lived before, wasn't going to fit into the mold that had been cast for her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the manicured grounds, Maria stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. It was a quiet evening, just her and the staff, but there was something in the air, something unspoken, seemed to hum with expectation. She could feel it in the way the others moved, the way they spoke in hushed tones, as though they were waiting for something to happen. Colin walked in, his face drawn and tired, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Maria pause. He leaned against the counter, folding his arms, watching her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "Maria," he said, his voice low, "you've changed things around here. The others, they talk about it. They talk about you." Maria didn't look up from her work. She wasn't sure what to say. It had been one thing to save Elise. But now that the deed was done, felt like everything was shifting. She had expected to go back to the way things were, to slip into the background, to be the Maid again. But it wasn't happening. The whispers were growing louder. The people who had once looked through her were starting to look at her. "You're making them see," Colin continued. "And that's something, Maria, you've made them see." She finished chopping the vegetables, yet her knife slicing through the air with precise, rhythmic movements. She set the blade down, wiped her hands on the apron, and turned to face him. "I didn't do it to make anyone see me," she said quietly. "I did it for Elise. I did it because she needed me, and I couldn't let her die. But I don't need their praise, Colin. I don't need their recognition." Colin nodded, his eyes softening. "I know, but it's more than just saving a life, Maria. You did something that no one else would have. You broke the rules, and the rules, those rules, are what keep us all in line. But you did what was right, even if it meant breaking every single one of those rules. And that's what people are talking about. That's why things are different now." Maria didn't reply immediately. She didn't know how to explain it, didn't know how to reconcile what she had done with the life she had lived. She had broken rules, yes, but was it enough to change everything? Was it enough to make a difference? Chris Graham had tried to sweep it all away, but there was something lingering now. The house was changing, and so was Maria. She didn't know where it would lead, but she felt it in her bones. Later that evening, as the staff gathered in the lounge, Maria stood near the window, looking out at the garden. The garden had always been a place of quiet retreat, a place where the flowers bloomed in their own time, where nothing ever seemed to change. But now, as she stood there, watching the moonlight dance on the water, she saw something new. She saw the possibility of change, not just for her, but for all of them. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. It was Chris. He had been quieter than usual in the last few days, and she had expected him to keep his distance. But here he was, standing in the doorway, looking at her with an expression that was harder to read than usual. "Maria," he said, his voice tentative, like he wasn't sure what to say. I want to thank you for what you did. For saving Elise." Maria met his gaze, her heart beating just a little faster. She had expected anger, accusations, even contempt. But this was different. This was a kind of acknowledgement she hadn't expected from him. "You don't have to thank me, Chris," she said, her voice steady. "I did what anyone would have done. She's your daughter. She needed help. I helped her." Chris took a step closer, his expression softening. "It's more than that, Maria. You did something no one else would have. You took a risk that no one else would have taken. And I didn't understand that at first. I didn't see it. But now I see it. And I don't know what to say except thank you." Maria swallowed, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't the apology she had wanted, no, but it was something, a kind of recognition. And maybe for now that was enough. "I didn't do it for you," she said quietly. "I did it for Elise, because she mattered. She matters." Chris nodded, his gaze distant now, but there was something more in it, something like understanding, something like change. "She does," he said softly. "She matters. And I need to learn how to be the father she needs." Maria looked at him then, really looked at him. And for the first time, she saw something more than the man who had once stood above her, who had looked down on her, who had made the rules. She saw a man who was lost, a man who didn't know how to navigate the wreckage of his own life. And in that moment, Maria realized something. She wasn't just a maid. She wasn't just the woman who cleaned his house. She was something more. Something that had nothing to do with the role she had been given, but everything to do with the choices she had made. "Chris," she said, her voice softer now, "maybe we can all learn how to be something better, together." He met her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't look away. The next few weeks moved like slow-moving currents, still and undisturbed on the surface. But beneath, a different energy churned. It wasn't a violent storm, but a quiet revolution, a shift so subtle that, at first, no one could quite put their finger on it. Maria remained at the estate, her place still undefined but undeniably real. She continued her work, but every step she took felt like it was in the shadow of something bigger, out to emerge. Chris, too, seemed to change, not in the dramatic way that Maria might have hoped, but in small, careful steps. He didn't shout as much. He didn't bark orders like he used to. He began to make eye contact with the staff, nodding at them as they went about their work, about their families and pay. But the biggest shift came when he started showing up at the dinner table, not just to eat but to engage. He began asking questions, even making small talk with the staff, as if he had forgotten what it meant to be human outside of his own empire. It was strange, but Maria could feel the weight of his transformation every time he crossed the room, his presence less domineering, more human, and for her that was unsettling. Because even though the man in front of her seemed different, she couldn't forget who he had been, the man who had screamed at her in front of an entire hospital waiting room, the man who had reduced her to nothing but a shadow of service. Still, something in Maria had begun to shift. The shadows of doubt that had once consumed her were slowly being replaced with a quiet confidence. She wasn't just a maid, a helper. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had taken control of her own destiny, stepped out of the shadows, and made sure Elise had a future. That was something the mansion's gilded walls could never take away from her. One evening, Maria was preparing a meal in the kitchen when the head chef approached her, his steps hesitant. It wasn't unusual for him to check in on things, but tonight his eyes carried a weight she hadn't seen before. He cleared his throat and took a step closer. "Maria," he began, his voice low, "I've been thinking about what happened, about you and the little girl." She paused in her work, glancing up at him, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "What about it?" "You're not just a housekeeper," he said, his words slow, careful. "You're something more. Something that has changed things around here. People are starting to talk. People are starting to see." Maria didn't know what to say. She had known the whispers were there. She had felt their gaze, heavier and more intense than ever. But she had tried not to let them define her. She had never sought recognition. She hadn't done it for praise, for validation. She had done it for Elise and for herself. But hearing it from someone else, someone who had worked at the estate for years, made her wonder just how much the world was shifting around her. She nodded, her hands still working with the vegetables, though her thoughts were elsewhere. "I didn't do it for recognition, Colin. I did it because it was the right thing to do." He smiled faintly. But there was something in his eyes that spoke of something more. "I know that, Maria. But don't sell yourself short. People notice, they notice the things that matter, and that's all that should matter." Before Maria could respond, the door opened and Chris stepped in. His eyes locked onto hers, but there was no coldness there anymore, no walls, just recognition. "Maria," he said, his voice measured, "the dinner's ready. Will you join us?" It wasn't a command. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation, one that had never been extended before. She glanced at Colin, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. And for the first time she didn't feel like she was intruding. She didn't feel like an outsider in her own world. "Of course," Maria replied softly, setting down her knife and walking toward the door. The dinner table was quieter than usual, but there was an air of something new, something tentative, like the calm before a storm, or perhaps the end of one. Chris was sitting at the head of the table, his shoulders relaxed in a way that seemed almost unfamiliar. Elise was there too, her small hand clutching a glass of water, her eyes wide with the curiosity only a child could have. And then there were the staff, Colin, Ryan, the chef, and others, seated at the table, all in a kind of comfortable silence. They were no longer just the invisible workers in the background. They were people, just like Chris, just like Maria. Chris cleared his throat as he looked around the table, his voice soft. "I've been thinking," he began, looking at each of them in turn, "about how things have been, about how we've been. I don't think I've ever really seen any of you, not the way I should have. And that's changing." Maria felt her heart tighten in her chest. The words, the acknowledgement, everything she had ever longed for had suddenly been laid out. But it was too late. Too little, too late. She had moved on. She had built something for herself, something that was no longer dependent on this house, on its walls, or on his approval. But there was still a part of her, a small, guarded part, that couldn't help but wonder if this was real, if the change was something that would stick. "You've done a lot for us, Maria," Chris continued, his eyes not meeting hers but drifting toward the others. "But I don't think I've ever truly thanked you for what you did. You saved my daughter's life. I won't forget that." There it was, the unspoken thing they had all been waiting for, the acknowledgement. Maria held his gaze for a moment, and then, with a quiet resolve, she nodded. "You don't have to thank me. I did it because I had to." The words hung in the air between them, suspended in the quiet acceptance of what had happened. Nothing needed to be said beyond that. No more words, no more gestures. The change had already occurred, and it wasn't just in Chris or Elise or the others at the table. It was in her too. For the first time, Maria felt a calm certainty, not about what the future would hold, but about who she was, about who she had become. The world had tried to define her, to cast her in shadows. But she had found her place, her voice, and it was hers. No one could take that away. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had saved a life, the hands that had worked tirelessly for years, the hands that had finally learned to stop hiding. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet change that had begun in the mansion continued to grow, slowly, like a seed breaking through the earth. Chris, though still a man defined by his wealth and power, seemed to walk a little lighter. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping proclamations, just small, steady shifts that left behind a sense of something real, something that had never been there before. Maria moved through the house with a kind of quiet confidence. She wasn't looking for anyone's approval, not Chris's, not the staff's, not the world's. She had found something deeper, something that could not be stripped away or taken from her. It wasn't power. It wasn't recognition. It was something quieter, something that had settled in her bones. It was peace. And yet even in this peace, there was still a nagging question that kept rising up again and again. What now? What was her place in all of this? She had saved Elise. She had broken through the walls of the Graham estate. But now that things had settled, what would she do with the life she had made for herself? One evening, as she sat on the edge of the balcony, watching the sun sink below the horizon, Colin approached. He had always been one to read the room, to notice the subtle shifts in the air. And tonight there was something in his expression that made Maria pause. He sat beside her, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For a moment, they didn't speak. The quiet stretched on, a shared silence that felt comfortable, familiar. "You've been different lately," Colin said finally, his voice soft, almost as if he didn't want to disrupt the calm. Maria didn't respond at first. She wasn't sure how to explain it, the way everything seemed both heavy and light at once. The weight of what had happened, what she had done, still sat with her, but it wasn't a burden. It wasn't something that held her down anymore. "I don't know what's next," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've done what needed to be done, but I still don't know where I fit in this world. I'm not the same woman I was when I got here." Colin nodded, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "That's true for all of us, Maria. No one stays the same. Not after they've seen the things you've seen, done the things you've done." She turned to him, her gaze questioning, "And what about you, Colin? What's next for you?" He chuckled softly, the sound rich with the kind of wisdom that came only with age. "I've been here longer than I care to admit. I've seen things change and I've seen things stay the same. But there's something about you, Maria. Something that makes me think that things don't have to stay the same, even in a place like this." Maria didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't sure what he meant, but there was something in his words, in the way he said them, that made her pause. It was as if, in his own quiet way, he was telling her that she had changed the very fabric of the estate, and somehow that change, however small, however subtle, had made an impact. "What do you think it is?" she asked softly, her eyes on the distant line of trees that marked the boundary of the estate. Colin turned to look at her, his gaze steady. "It's the way you see people, Maria. The way you make them feel like they matter. That's something no one here's ever done before." "Not the way you do." Maria swallowed hard, the words settling in her chest like a weight. She had always seen people, always treated them as though they were more than the role they played. But she hadn't realized how rare that was, how much people needed that. "I never wanted to change things," she said quietly. "Oh, but maybe I was meant to." Colin smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Maybe you were. You never know what kind of ripples your actions can create, Maria. But I think you've already started something here. Something bigger than any of us." She didn't know what to say to that. What could she say? She had never set out to change anything. She had only acted because it was the right thing to do. And now, standing here, in the midst of everything, she wasn't sure where that would lead her. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it didn't matter. It didn't matter if she had all the answers. It didn't matter if she knew where she fit in the grand scheme of things. What mattered was that she had acted, she had stood up when no one else would. She had made her mark, and maybe that was enough. Chris's footsteps approached, and for a moment Maria thought he might say something. But instead he stopped beside her, his hands in his pockets. "Everything's ready," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "Elise's coming home tomorrow." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with relief. Elise was finally going to be okay. The little girl who had once clung to her, the one who had seen Maria as more than just the help, she was going to be all right. And that was enough. "Thank you," Maria said softly, her voice full of emotion, "for letting me be part of this, for letting me help." Chris nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something softer, something more human, that made Maria believe he understood. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he once seemed. The next morning, as the staff gathered in the lounge, there was a different energy in the air. Elise was coming home. And for the first time in a long time, Maria realized, the house was no longer just a place of silence. It was a place where people mattered. It was a place where dignity had been restored, and where hope had taken root. As she stood in the center of the lounge, watching the staff talk quietly, Maria felt a shift in the air. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She wasn't just the woman who had saved a life. She was something more, and for the first time she felt like she had finally found her place. The day Elise came home was marked by a quiet sense of anticipation, a gathering of energy that had been building for weeks. The staff moved with purpose, and the house itself felt alive in a way it hadn't before. It was as though everything was aligned. Finally, the silence that had once filled the halls was being replaced with something warmer, something that spoke of change. Maria stood in the front hallway, her hands clasped together, waiting. She didn't need to be told when Elise arrived. She could feel it. There was a change in the air, an unspoken shift that told her the girl was near. And when the car doors opened and she saw Chris gently guiding Elise out, her heart surged. Elise was walking, a little unsteady, but walking. Her curls were still wild, but there was a brightness in her eyes, a lightness that hadn't been there before. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. Elise's face lit up at the sound of her voice. "Mama Maria!" she exclaimed, running to her with the kind of joy that could only come from a child who had come through something dark and found the light again. Maria knelt to meet her, wrapping her arms around the little girl. The warmth of Elise's embrace was everything Maria had fought for, everything that had brought her to this moment. For a moment, nothing else existed. There was only Elise. There was only the love between them. It didn't matter that Maria had never been recognized as family, that she had never been given a place at the table. In this moment, Maria knew she had been seen. Seen by the child who had never looked at her as anything but the person who had saved her life. Chris stood a few steps away, watching them. His expression was unreadable, but there was a softness in his gaze now, something that Maria had never seen before. He wasn't looking at her with judgment or anger. He wasn't seeing her as the maid anymore. He was seeing her as something more. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough, "for saving her." For bringing her home. Maria stood up, holding Elise's hand in hers. "She saved herself," Maria said, softly. "All I did was help her get to the hospital." Chris nodded, his eyes still on Elise. "You're right. But you did more than that. You gave me back the one thing I didn't know how to protect. You gave me my daughter." Maria felt a tightness in her chest, a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. She had done what needed to be done, but it was strange. This moment, this acknowledgement, this quiet understanding between them, she had expected more anger, more resentment. But Chris's words, though few, carried with them a weight that Maria had never thought he would offer. "You're not alone in this," she said, her voice steady. "Not anymore." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of understanding, of a bond forged through the most unexpected of circumstances. Elise tugged at Maria's hand, her face lit up with a child's simple joy. "Mama Maria, can we play?" Maria smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. A smile she hadn't realized she had missed. Of course, sunshine. As they walked to the garden, Maria felt the weight of the years she had spent in the background, in the shadows finally lifting. She had always known what it meant to love, what it meant to care. But now, as she watched Elise run ahead of her, laughing, full of life, she realized something else. She wasn't just a caretaker. She wasn't just the maid, the helper. She was a mother, in every sense of the word that mattered. And in Elise's eyes, she had always been family. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows over the estate, Maria sat in the garden with Elise, her arm around the girl's shoulders as they watched the birds fly across the sky. Chris was standing a little ways off, his back to them, hands shoved into his pockets, but his gaze turned toward them, watching. Maria didn't know if he was looking at her or at Elise. It didn't matter. She had earned this moment. Colin, Ryan, and the rest of the staff had gathered in the kitchen, but Maria knew they were aware of what had happened. They could feel the shift, the small change in the air. For the first time, the servants, the ones who had always been silent and invisible, were seen. And that, too, was something Maria had fought for. It wasn't just Elise who had been given a chance. It was all of them. Maria leaned her head against Elise's, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of her daughter's breath fill her ears. This was what it was all for. This was what mattered. "Hey, Mama Maria," Elise said, her voice soft, almost shy. Maria turned to look at her. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I love you," Elise whispered, her small hand resting in Maria's. Maria's heart skipped a beat, the words sinking deep into her chest. "I love you too, Elise. I always have." And in that moment, Maria realized that everything she had ever done, everything she had fought for, had led her here, to this life, to this family. It hadn't been about the rules or the wealth or the mansion. It had been about love, about seeing, truly seeing, the people around her. And in that seeing, in that quiet act of care, she had created something that no one could take away from her. As the evening deepened and the stars began to emerge above them, Maria looked up, a quiet peace settling in her chest. She wasn't just the woman who had stolen a car. She wasn't just the maid, the helper, the one who had been overlooked for years. She was the woman who had changed everything, and now she could finally breathe. The days that followed felt like the slow unwinding of a story that had once seemed impossible. The Graham estate, once a place of rigid rules and invisible boundaries, was now becoming something else, something softer, something that breathed in ways it hadn't before. Maria had always moved quietly through its halls, blending into the shadows. Oh, now she moved with purpose, kite her steps leaving traces of change in the dust. The house no longer felt like an empty shell, but like a living thing, responding to the presence of the people who inhabited it. Chris, though still a man of wealth and power, seemed to have become more aware of the space around him. There was no grand gesture, no grand pronouncements, but his demeanor had shifted. He wasn't as quick to bark orders. He didn't hold himself with the same air of unchallenged authority. Instead, when he passed Maria in the halls, his gaze was softer, less accusatory. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and for a fleeting moment there would be an unspoken understanding. But Maria didn't need him to change for her to feel at peace. She had changed. She was no longer the woman who hid in the background, waiting to be overlooked. She had come to understand her worth, not through his eyes, but through her own. One evening, as the house settled into its evening rhythm, Maria found herself standing at the edge of the garden. The air was cool, carrying the scent of freshly bloomed jasmine, and the evening sky was painted in shades of pink and gold. It felt peaceful, almost surreal, as though the weight of everything she had lived through was falling away. Bit by bit, "Maria," a voice called softly. She turned to see Colin walking toward her, his steps slow, as though he knew something had changed. The weight of his years seemed to rest in his eyes, but there was also something new, an understanding. "You've done something here, Maria," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Not just with Elise, but with all of us. People are starting to believe they matter. And that's something we've never had before." Maria didn't respond at first. She wasn't sure what to say. She had never set out to make anyone believe they mattered. She had only set out to save a life. But now, hearing Colin's words, she realized how much more her actions had affected the world around her. "I did it because I had to," she said quietly. "I didn't do it for any reward." "But maybe this is what it was all for," Colin nodded, his gaze shifting to the garden in front of them. "You've changed more than you know. You've made people believe in their own worth. You've made them see." Maria looked out over the garden, her thoughts drifting. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to be the one who changed anything. She had just wanted to save Elise. And in doing so, she had set off a chain reaction that no one had anticipated. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Chris walked into view. He stood for a moment watching Maria and Colin from a distance, and then slowly made his way toward them. His presence, once commanding, was now subdued, quieter, like the man he had been was slowly becoming someone new. "Maria," he said, his voice soft. "There's something I need to say." Maria turned toward him, her heart beating a little faster. She didn't know what to expect from him, but she had never expected him to approach her like this, calm, almost apologetic. "I've been thinking about everything," he continued. His eyes on the ground for a moment before meeting hers. "What you did, it wasn't just brave, it was something else. You saved my daughter. You saved my family. And he paused, his voice catching for a moment. "I didn't know how to see that. I didn't know how to see you, but now I do." Maria didn't know how to respond. There was no need for gratitude. She hadn't done it for him. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. But hearing him say those words, hearing him acknowledge what had happened, was something she hadn't expected. "I didn't do it for thanks, Chris," she said, her voice steady. "I did it for her, because she mattered. And sometimes that's all you need to make the right choice." Chris was quiet for a moment, as though her words had settled inside him, finding a place where nothing had ever fit before. "I don't know what to say, but thank you," he said finally. His voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving her, and for showing me, showing all of us what really matters." Maria didn't reply. She didn't need to. The change was real. It was already happening, not just in him, but in her, too. She had found her place, not through the recognition or approval of others, but through the quiet strength of doing what was right. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. As the evening grew darker, Maria walked back to the house with Elise at her side. The girl's laughter, once tinged with the fear of uncertainty, was now full of joy, a sound that seemed to fill every corner of the estate. That night, as Maria stood at the window of her small apartment, looking out at the stars, she realized that the story she had lived was no longer a story of survival. It was a story of rebirth. She had been born again in a way she hadn't expected, in a way that had nothing to do with wealth or status. It had to do with the courage to act when no one else would. It had to do with seeing people, with recognizing their worth and lifting them up even when the world tried to make them invisible. The weight of the past had fallen away, leaving room for something new. And for the first time, Maria Wilson knew she had found her place, not in a mansion or a family's name, but in her own heart, in the quiet space where love and justice could finally bloom. Thank you for following this story on Shoe Stories. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you reflect on the meaning of silence, please like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below the video. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, whether it's in silence or loud, and don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos displayed on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity and unexpected heroes. We'll see you in the next story.